From the John Martinson 4D Experience Lab at Purdue University, I'm Mercer Applin. Welcome to First Fridays at Fusion Studio. This is the last First Fridays webinar of the academic year, and we're so glad that you're here to close out the season with us. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce Jordan Tani. Jordan is a leader in the world of audio system design and immersive sound with a career that spans live performance, theatrical sound design, product marketing, and cutting-edge work in spatial audio technologies. Over the years, Jordan has held senior roles in audio engineering and product strategy, working at the intersection of creative sound design and the technical systems that bring it to life. We've got some cool stuff to talk about today. Jordan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll dive right in.
Sure.
Well, we'll start with some foundations. What are we actually talking about? In plain language, what is immersive audio and how is it different from stereo, surround, or the kind of left, center, right sound that most theaters still run?
Cool. Yeah. So in immersive audio or spatial audio, I feel like there's similar terminology used for this type of format. It's at its simplest, I would say that it's a multi-channel system that it's, you could say something like a 5.1, but obviously it can be expanded and custom depending on your type of deployment. Um, from an intention kind of standpoint, immersive audio is designed to be able to create a larger canvas or playground for you to spatialize sound and have that be in conjunction with a story or music or something along those lines. By having more resolution in your sound system, as in speakers and processing and things like that, it allows you for more movements and control over how you want to place the sound and design it and think about sound in other ways than you could get in like a traditional stereo system, which would be just your main left and main right with limited ability to pan and move things around.
Mhm.
I would say that that's at its kind of fundamental, the heart of it.
Great. Um, I think you've touched on this already, but what are the fundamental goals of spatial or immersive sound? Um, what is it actually trying to achieve for the audience, the performers on stage, and the designers who implement and produce these sorts of systems and the content for them?
Hmm? I would say one of the fundamental goals of immersive audio, spatial audio is to be able to create environments that bring the story or the world or the music to life with dimensionality. Even at
Mhm.
its simplest, way, way back without any of the modern tech, if you're doing like theater and you have upstage Foley sounds or a practical speaker, that in itself is immersive. You're bringing a section of a theater or a moment to life that gives it position and location. And even stripping away a lot of the tech, um, I always kind of refer back to immersion in the sense of you being in a place, a space where you're surrounded by things or deeply engaged with something. Um, when I would often talk about this in demos, is that sometimes our most memorable experiences come from maybe a musical performance that has zero PA. You're in a
Mhm.
jazz club or a bar or something like that, and maybe it's an acoustic set and a performer and the instruments are there. You can close your eyes and point to where everything is. If they walk around, you know where it is. You can localize to it, and it's intimate potentially. You're connected with the performers. You don't have a barrier of technology sometimes in the way, and because it's a very sensorial, like full sensory experience, it can often be memorable. And the goals of a sound system within that context are to try and embody that, bring it to life, and also expand it with the tech that a sound system can do. And so that's that's I feel like the main fundamental goal of the approach for immersive design, especially in a theatrical
Mhm.
context. It changes a little bit when you're doing like live concerts and things like that, but still I think the goal is to bring connection, whether it's to the performers, to the music, to something that you, the audience, or the designer might have a personal connection with, and amplify that and make it larger than life sometimes, or very much more realistic, and for as wide of an audience as possible.
That's fascinating. How does that translate, to venues of different scale or productions of different scale?
Mm-hmm.
I imagine the approach has some similarities, but profound differences
Mm-hmm.
between trying to do something spatial or immersive in a 100-seat room all the way up to a 1,500-seat room to a 17,000-seat room.
Right.
Uh, I imagine
Yeah.
the content side is relatively similar, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the system design side that needs to flex. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit, it's like the system side for sure, and your context. Because I would also say that immersive and spatial audio, especially nowadays, it doesn't really have to just be the thought of speakers around you, full 360 overheads. That's nice. Like if I could have my my cake and eat it too type of situation, like every sound system would have all of that. But even just five loudspeakers or 5 points across your performing area, the proscenium in this case for theater, something like that. Even that can make it much more immersive with how you use the audio. It's LCR plus two at its kind of simplest, is what a lot of us in the spatial audio world within all the manufacturers and creating these solutions have kind of all converged on, is is that. Now what changes is the scalability for sure, and that often informs how many speakers you need, how much gear you need, um, and sometimes your creative potential depending on the story and what's going on. So especially in a theatrical sense, in black box environments or small scale, maybe you're doing something in the round, you have different set configurations that can often inform how you do the system design. If you're in the round, you might have loudspeakers or pointing at different seating sections, but that also can inform maybe a full surround and overhead system to envelop the audience, because it kind of works out that way a little bit. And it could also be used for music and sound effects and some of those things in addition to dialogue. Now, what will change, and it's kind of like a weird thing to wrap your head around sometimes, depending on what you're going for, but in smaller environments, you will often need more speakers than in a bigger room. And a lot of it is coverage and the ability to localize and to hear all the speakers. The closer you are to the speaker, the more that one is in play.
Mhm.
And depending on its coverage pattern, if it's 100 degrees wide, 140, 70, that will inform how many speakers you need to make sure that you're covering the entire area. I what I was related to, that speakers are invisible flashlights. If you look at the spec sheet, it's maybe 100 degrees wide. And so that is like the same type of beam or a width of a light. And so if you're trying to evenly light a stage or make sure you have enough light to do a lot of your intricate theatrical lighting moments, you need more lights to be able to make sure it's well lit and do all the kind of fun colors and stuff you want to do. Sound is very much the same way, where
Mhm.
if you want everyone to hear the thing, you have to make sure that everyone's going to be within that beam. So then as you're doing more systems and more speakers, you need to make sure that every speaker within your environment is also covering as much of the audience as possible. So in a smaller room, you might need to have more speakers because the distance of your closest audience member to the speaker might be minimal, like a couple feet,
Right.
versus a larger theater or performing arts center when the distance from the speaker is 50 feet. That beam of the
Right. So,
flashlight gets wider
yeah.
the further away you are.
Right.
So,
So what you're saying is, when we're in a smaller venue, you're closer to the lamp in the flashlight.
mhm,
You're further up the cone,
yep,
and therefore you need more speakers to kind of overlap in that early place right after it leaves the business end.
right. And that's where the challenge becomes, because in a realistic world, we have a finite number of speakers within our inventory, perhaps within our programs and theater, or what's at hand gear wise. It's also a budget thing. If you're doing a rental or an activation or a new install, how much can you afford for the sound system? And what's practical? Because
Hmm.
we want to design and make sure that as much of the audience as possible is in this environment, but oftentimes that is not always the case. And so we want to make
Right.
sure that, if we can get, if a standard like stereo rig covers 50% of the audience to make sure that those flashlight beams are overlapping, maybe it's only 20% of that audience actually gets both, perhaps, or
Right.
40%, whatever the type of deployment is. And if you can double that to make it 80%, 90%, that's still really, that's great. And so we always try and shoot for 100%, but reality often makes it a little bit more challenging.
Sure. And I think that makes sense if you're, yeah, thinking about seats on the extreme sides of a venue or somewhere where you're only able to hear a certain number of those individual speakers. That will impact the level of immersion or spatiality you experience. I want to pivot a little bit more towards the creative side of things, and kind of think about these sorts of systems in the context of a theater production, right? Um, can you point to a moment in a show, whether it's one of the shows that you worked on or something that you've experienced, where the immersive design was doing real dramatic work, where the storytelling would have been measurably weaker without it?
Yeah. So I was working on a production with Secret Garden. We might touch on this a little bit later. But that was
Hmm.
a full-on immersive system that had, let's see, we had five across the front, eight surrounds, 20 overhead. So it was like a very comprehensive, about like a 24 channel system, all things considered. And within that show, and in the context of that, at the piece, moments where there are characters that are ghosts, essentially. They're of the past. And there's a big scene where there's a whole mansion and there's basically ghosts of these shadows of these people are moving across the stage, and they're the ensemble within this number. And in the blocking of that part of the show, they're kind of swirling around the main character as they enter the mansion. And we wanted to recreate that feeling. So we have the surrounds, as much coverage as we can, and using the reverb part, like the ghostliness of that type of sonic quality that we were looking for. That was kind of moving around the venue as their blocking was being more dynamic. So it would start off more frontally loaded as you're looking
Mm.
at it, and then once the door opens, you're in the mansion, and it's scary and spooky, and these ghosts start to come out. Then it starts to move out into the house, move around a little bit, and it's a lot of breathing and ebbing and flowing, and that's you could feel the audience become much more captivated, and the big finale of that piece, everything would increase. We increased the reverb to it, and so the entire theater started to feel like this old haunted mansion that had a very long reverb time, and it just hang in the space, and it filled the entire room, and it really had much more of a significant impact on the audience because it was truly around them, and we kind of tried to put them in that feeling of this old dusty mansion. And I think with doing that in just out of stereo system would not have had the same impact, both within the singing of the actors and the ensemble, as well as the space created with the reverb.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and of course, this is kind of the creative element, not the we want to make sure that in the round when a
Mm-hmm.
cast member has their back to the audience, that, they're still able to hear what's being said, but perhaps
Mm-hmm.
in a more spatially convincing way than, a kind of more ham-fisted system design approach.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's an old adage in sound design, that the best mix is the one that the audience never thinks about. Um, Hearing about some of the theatrical implications of the work that you've done and the work that you're continuing to do, is that approach still the approach? I mean, I imagine that uh, some attention needs to be paid to balancing, enveloping the audience with immersive elements, but before becoming distracting. How
Yeah,
does that play out usually?
Yeah, I think that adage is still true in some regards. But then I think the context changes. And for things such as live performance, whether that's in a musical or it's a live concert, when you have a more resolution in your system, oftentimes of the productions I've been involved in and I've also just been witness to is that it's the the characteristics of describing sound being maybe all around you or more enveloping. That's not what we get feedback from the audience as they exit the show or an intermission. A lot of the times they say it feels larger than life. I'm enveloped in the music. I can hear things a lot more clearer. And
Mhm.
uh, I think it's not really recreating the headphone experience because you can't really ever capture that and bring that into a live audience because it's very different. But the same kind of feeling of if someone were to put on a record and listen to that and actually have a wider sound stage, it's trying to bring that more to life and bring that to the audience. And it's something that's quite visceral. So it's oftentimes audience would be saying like maybe this is the first time I've heard all the lyrics in a show in a long
Mhm.
time. I've been able to close my eyes and see where everything is and hear where everything is. And it's also just we could also say like a higher fidelity type of experience in terms of audio. And it's it can often be more impactful, I think, from a visceral sense. I It's the same way of trying to equate it to like lighting, where the more things you can do with the light and the presentation of that, as it's a very visual thing, the more dynamic elements you can have within a lighting design, coupled with that same type of approach with sound, I think is just something that is guttural.
Right.
And
Yeah, I mean, I think my experiences with spatial sound definitely resonate with what you're saying. One of the first kind of large scale deployments that I experienced was a Bon Iver tour that came through Chicago,
mhm,
and I remember um, being able to pick the vocal out much more clearly, in addition to kind of feeling like I was part of
mhm,
standing on stage with all the members of the band kind of around me.
mhm,
Um, but in addition to those sorts of kind of storytelling or um, aesthetic benefits of spatial or immersive audio. Um, are there other benefits? I think we use the example of an in the round show where
mhm.
a performer might have their back to you. Are there other examples of when this technology can help solve problems rather than delivering creative solutions?
Yeah. From a very practical standpoint, and we've done this in theater, this is also an entire solution in and of itself in terms of installation is acoustic enhancement systems or active acoustics, whatever you want to call it. But basically, those are systems that have microphones and loudspeakers that are fully enveloping and they allow you to transform the sound of a space in terms of its size. Um,
Mhm.
where you might have a black box theater, you have all these microphones and speakers, you clap, it sounds one way, you turn on the system, you change its acoustic settings via DSP and reverb and all these things, and now it sounds like a parking garage. And that can be a very functional thing. It's obviously can be used in a theatrical storytelling environment. Small room, you enter a new space, you're putting everyone in that environment. But from a practical standpoint as well, like a musical sense, it can be an incredible tool for the musicians and matching the type of program content of that music to the space. Where classical music is a fantastic example for this. A lot of the
Mhm.
original music of that time, chamber music, was played in a chamber, often a
Right.
medium small space. And the acoustics played a very important part in the type of music that was played, where in smaller environments with less natural reverb, and that allows you to be able to have more articulate movements, especially within a smaller set first violin, second violin, cello, viola, something along those lines, you can have a lot more detail and fast-paced movements because you can hear a lot of that more, as in you're not hearing maybe the sound of a cathedral with a long hang of reverb, which is where like maybe choral sections and longer, more legato type of movements coupling with the larger reverberations of that space sound fantastic. And then if you have a room or a theater that can modify and change that depending on the type of music, then you can be much more flexible in its approach. And that's more of a solution to maybe a function of the architecture, the space, also the type of things that are happening within that one environment. Maybe you have one
Mhm.
theater on campus or your performing arts center that's doing different stuff throughout the entire year and even maybe the same day. And if you have a system that can do something like that, you can have your performance of the orchestra in the morning, and then later that night you have a concert that is rock or a theatrical environment, and you can change those settings and have it be much more appropriate for that type of music. And it could be the same loudspeaker system that you use for all the fun sound effects and movements. And so maybe it can be used for both applications. So that can be a very practical and functional use of a system for both musical performance and creative stuff as well.
Yeah, I imagine that being able to swing the acoustic response of the room, at the press of a button,
Mm-hmm.
can be a operationally open a lot of doors in terms of
Mm-hmm.
what you can schedule and when you can schedule it, and who wants to come play in your room, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to pivot a little bit towards kind of your background and how you got into the industry. But first, I wanted to remind our audience that if you have any questions for Jordan, feel free to drop those in the Q&A window, and I'll keep an eye out for those and feather them into conversation where I can. So don't be shy about that.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of going back to your background, you started in educational and regional theater, Chautauqua, South Coast Rep, the Geffen, uh, and ended up kind of in this space working in both the creative and the technical side of immersive audio technology. Was there a specific show or a specific moment where you saw this kind of stuff in use where earlier in your career, and where you kind of latched onto it as being something compelling that you wanted to continue with?
Yeah, when I was first starting to get into theater sound and everything like that, this is even when I was an undergrad before I really decided to pursue that path. I was at UC San Diego for my bachelor's and just starting to get into the theater program in my last couple of years. And I remember watching a production of The Grapes of Wrath,
Mm.
and within their little small, black box 150 seat theater kind of space, they did have one of these acoustic systems going on using Constellation, and very similar in that environment to match the theatrical storytelling, where maybe you're on the planes, it's very open, change to something that's more monologue or an aside, lights dim, focus on the spotlight, and it's internal thoughts and the acoustics change. And you hear this,
Mm.
and you physically are in a different space. Coupled with sound effects and things moving around, that was a pretty impactful experience as an audience member of just enjoying theater. And once I was in grad school at UCI, a lot of my productions, just by nature of the set design, ended up calling for an immersive design. Um, Most of my productions end up being in the round of some kind, and the story and the elements within the script analysis and everything like that informed that having a multi-channel system allowed for the sonic storytelling of big moments. Even my first large-scale main stage at UC Irvine was a production called Our Class, and it
Mm.
was kind of around the World War II time, about Jewish uh, within the Nazi regime in Poland, all these kind of things like that. And that story was about a group of kids going through their entire life. Some who grew up Polish, some were German in ancestry, and kind of where their stories diverge as that time period progressed.
Hmm.
And that was done in the round. And there's a moment within that show where there's a barn that is on fire and it starts to burn. And that scene is we are inside this barn and it's burning down. And the set and the notes from the playwright were pretty explicit on wanting to have an enveloping sound, or at least that feeling of it. And so that already called for a system that could reproduce or make you feel like you're inside of this burning barn. And it needed some type of multi-channel system to do that within surrounds and overheads. And then pretty much every other show I've been on within the theater side ended up being in the round or something like that where it's called for it. And so it kind of, I ended up going in that path anyway, but I also wanted to do so. And every time I got to work on a production like that, it was trying to use new tech or a new element within those systems to do something fun. But it really did start from a pretty visceral experience, and acoustics, while potentially less fun creatively, especially in the design side, it's something that everyone will understand. That you're not a sound person, you change how a room sounds, everyone hears it, everyone feels it, and it's so visceral because it plays with how your brain thinks about how a space sounds, and you change it, and everyone is very natural to react in a certain way. And that was really electrifying. And wanting to try and always recreate that has been something that I've wanted to work towards.
That's a great answer. We've got a question from Jeremy in the chat. What trade-offs should be considered when designing for these types of systems? What do you give up or compromise? Are there ways to leverage a hybrid of spatial and more traditional system design?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, compromises. So depending on the type of show or production that you're working on, I think can inform the type of systems that you'll go with. If it's something that's more frontal in terms of maybe in theater environment, is it on the proscenium type of things like that? Is it a musical? Is it a straight play? And if the if the story as well kind of all inform this, maybe it's more frontally loaded where it's maybe very dialogue heavy and you want to amplify the voices. So maybe is that a an LCR plus two, five across the front type of situation with more surrounds? Because not every show needs to have surrounds. And so the compromise there can be how many speakers do I have? What type of gear am I available? Um, as well as the content choices. And a lot of those things within the the landscape now, within the tech to do immersive and spatial audio approaches. You have solutions for the manufacturers like L Acoustics, D&B, Meyer Sound, Adamson, Flux, all these things with their products, Elisa, Soundscape, so on. And with those solutions, you can do a lot of powerful things. But even with QLab, and especially QLab 5 now with their built-in spatial audio tools, it makes it so much more accessible than being able to just fade from one output to another output. So the tech at hand makes it more accessible from the creative side and implementation. But still, it's going to be largely, I would say, what do you want to do creatively? And the sound system is like the engine of a car. And within that, if you want to use stereo deployments, especially if you have stereo audio from like a WAV file that's used for this type of music, that is the source content that you have, and so you can mix that within your canvas of sound. And so you can have multi-channel audio, individual stems or individual multi-tracks, plus layered stereo content, and you can still, in a musical environment, still put your vocals in the center if that's the limitations that you have. Even being able to just spread out your band in a musical approach can be a much more benefit. It's kind of like an A/B system, but maybe a little bit more resolution And so
Mm,
even we've seen shows where you might spatialize the band and give that much more of a breathing room, but then leave your vocals more centered. Um, and that could be a system design thing, that could be a mixing choice. Again, that could also be compromises within the type of loudspeakers you have and what is capable within the audience. And collaboration as we work with lighting and set design and all those things, those are often still the same compromises that we make in achieving a comprehensive and cohesive production.
right. I
Yeah.
imagine that one potential consideration or trade-off is how much time you have to tack a performance, right?
Mhm.
Because,
Yes.
if we're thinking about, traditional sound design or musical theater sound design as it's been done for, I don't know, the past 30 years,
Mhm.
um, while space is an important element of that, you're not quite as focused on that 4D element of things, potentially moving, the acoustic response of the room, altering using this technology.
Mhm.
And so I imagine it takes more time to think about and to execute those elements of a spatial sound design. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, time and workflow are some of the biggest challenges, and that's something that the industry is still working towards and always wanting to improve. But that's also that is one of the variables that makes it a big factor in how we approach these systems in what you can do within the time that you're allotted. Because
Mm,
at the end of the day, your show has to go on. You have to have at least the very core things within your base system and the base show. Can I hear all the audience? Or can I hear all the performers? Can I get my sound effects in and the music in? And that has to work first before any of the fancy fun stuff. And with that in mind, though, especially nowadays with all these tools at our disposal that allow for pre production elements, you can do a lot of that work before you're ever in the theater, right? There's tools from like Flux Immersive or Spat Revolution, Eliza Studio that have a binaural component to it. So you can, just like lighting previs, you can do a lot of your system and content design early, and especially with content in theater, if you're in the tech table and trying to add in sound effects and you need to play your cues and spatialize it, that's the biggest time, especially when you're either working early mornings, overnight, late night, or in between breaks in the theater. Um, you can do a lot of the spatial part of that earlier in the game so that once you're in the room, you're more prepared and you're not making those compromises of, well, let's cut this because I don't have time to do it. And
right.
that's often the case when you have more at your disposal because you want to do more things. I want to spatialize this, I want to add this type of sound, but where is it in your priority list? And if you're having a
Right.
week of tech or 2 weeks of tech, um, the show still has to run first. It's got to be a full comprehensive show with all the design elements. And now being able to have more of those prepared things ahead of time allows you to have more headroom, both technically and creatively, once you're in that space. Because you might not be fighting the tech of how do I pan this? How do I automate this and program it? I've got that done already. Maybe now it's just adjusting the timing of it instead of building all those fades or the snapshot to move everything. That's already done. And so now you can focus on how do I do this more creatively or modify this to work in the space that we're physically in instead of trying to do all of that within your 1 hour of quiet time or something along those lines.
Right. Yeah, that I think that is certainly an important consideration to kind of, not take too big a bite if you have very limited time. Um, you've spent years in the manufacturer side of the business on platforms that are used by designers all over the world. Are there things that surprised you about how spatial or immersive audio systems get developed and are brought to market? And I realize you can't share too many details about this, but
um, it the surprising part I think is at least of the world that I've been in and the companies I've been involved with is still the agility with which they're able to develop a lot of these things. And a lot of it too is You have really passionate people that are really into this particular type of audio and these type of things. Um, and within a company, at the end of the day, like they have to sell speakers or sell product and make sure that everyone gets paid and all these type of things. And they are getting pulled in a lot of different directions from a lot of different types of genres of
Hmm.
performance. Whether this is going to be something acoustical, as in working with acousticians and consultants for an acoustic enhancement system, which is very different from a theatrical sound design or a live concert for 20,000 people. And the needs of those creatives and those artists are different. If it's musical performance, maybe you just want to have more tools that are readily available on your ecosystem of the front of house console, something like that. So that's more of a workflow type of approach than creative fun bells and whistles. If you're theater, you want some of that still, especially in musical theater, but I want the ability to have more flexibility with how I pan things, maybe more tools and fun effects. And it's impressive to me that like within our industry and within all the manufacturers that these tools and things are being thought of, and there's a long roadmap that we've all had to add these features. And I think that's what makes it more approachable in some ways is, let's say this release is going to have these features for this art for this market, but we're also working on this next release which is going to be features for this market. So instead of trying to do everything all at once, we're going to do it little by little and still make sure that the widest audience can use these tools. And the addition to that is maybe making it is like perfection is the enemy of good or great in that sense. And I think even good is maybe lower than what our standards are in the industry. But you have a multi-channel reverb engine or something like that. Make a pretty good one first off that will do a lot of what you need to do creatively. And then we have a ambition to make this way better. Let's work on that throughout all these next releases, and then maybe in a year or two we'll make a V2 of it. Instead of making the perfect V1,
Hmm.
everyone's always going to have feedback and criticism and things to improve any tool, regardless of how good it is, especially from a workflow standpoint or sonic things, maybe with convolution reverb or other types of things. So there's always going to be feedback on that. So the development of features that will be successful for as many people as possible, yet we still want to continue to iterate and improve that. That's what I've found is really intriguing about it because it's different than perhaps a loudspeaker approach because it's still software based and software is
Right.
more agile than you don't like build a brand new speaker every 6 months, especially when
Right.
it's in an install. You might have these products for years and for decades. It still has to sound good, perform, maybe be weatherized. However, your computer and your operating systems and the software can be much more flexible and more accessible to a larger audience. So that level of development is faster, yet it still has to work within a larger ecosystem and play with more departments and other manufacturers, for like live consoles and live audio, or within Pro Tools or your DAW with plugins. So there's a lot more interconnectedness within that world. And to see those come online and with every other solution, that's been really cool to see.
Yeah, that I think you alluded to this a bit, but it sounds like the folks who are implementing these systems are really valuable in terms of giving you requests for features to add, giving you feedback on how the existing tech is working.
Mhm.
Um, how much how much involvement is there on the manufacturer side to try and bring in voices from both the sound engineering community, the artist community, and kind of how do you balance those, each specific request?
Mhm. Uh, Typically, like at least where I've been involved, you have your different application engineers or your different specialists that are maybe regional or market driven. that work with these individuals. So maybe you have someone who's theater minded versus someone who's live sound minded, and as they interact with their clients and their partners and seeing what how the tools are working, they can then send that feedback to the development and the product management teams. And we would also have a core set of beta testers within these different segments. Maybe it's going to be a DJ, maybe it'll be, or a set of DJs, maybe it'll be a set of theatrical sound designers, live front of house engineers, and they would get an early release to test and play with and also give that feedback. And the thing within maybe like a product management side is kind of we're like the gate between, or the funnel essentially between the development internal within a company and how we communicate about it or develop it, and then as well as the external side. And a lot of the times we are the ones that kind of bring that information to the developers because we're the
Mm.
external voice sometimes. And it's the ability to be able to write the use cases in a way that makes sense from both a development and a business standpoint. Because for a lot of the manufacturers and like especially on speaker side is that's what how the companies make money at the end of the day is by selling amplifiers and loudspeakers and all that kind of stuff. And what type of markets will allow us to sell to those kind of places. And in terms of like theater itself is a more smaller market than like the live touring and concert industry. Yet there's still an incredibly vocal and an important part of this industry, especially on the creative side. And oftentimes you have
Mhm.
theater people working in other industries from the skill sets that you get by working in theater. And so the requests from the theater side, especially as I've been involved in it as well, is definitely on the more creative applications, the UX and UI, how you approach things, because it's much more hands-on than what you might find in a live concert environment. And how I would get that feedback and write it in a way that is targeted for that audience, but also a main benefit to everyone else. Meaning like, oh, okay, well, this is meant for theater. However, this feature, if this were to be developed, benefits everybody. And so
Right.
that's the way to word it and present it that yes, it's meant for this audience, but if we go down this path, it's not just maybe focusing on maybe 10% of the market at whole. This is going to benefit 85% of it.
Hmm.
So that's the thing of that side of product development, especially within a larger company. It's a little different when you have a smaller one, and especially maybe software based, where they can address those things in a faster environment. Um, so you might have products on the software side that are more comprehensive in the tool set and all the features, especially um, for research purposes as well, something like that. But then your hardware side is that's what you got to figure out on your own. So those are also where those compromises come from in the solutions that you work with and choose. At the end of the day, they all do fun things, and it's whatever
Right.
works best for your workflow.
Let's talk about workflow for a minute. I mean, I associate these sorts of systems being in, the flagship cultural venues,
Mm-hmm.
around the country and around the world. But we're seeing them kind of make their way into higher education now and be implemented in the context of university theater department production. Here at Purdue, we're dipping our toes into immersive audio, and I know you've had some experience working with CCM
Mm-hmm.
and their 2020 production of Secret Garden, which again we touched on briefly earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And the system that you put together for the Secret Garden was kind of one of the most comprehensive early deployments in academia in
Mm-hmm.
terms of number of loudspeakers, capabilities of processing, and integration with other technology. Um, what did putting that kind of system into a student production teach you about um, resources, workflow, et cetera, that the largest scale deployments, didn't teach you?
Uh, so within a educational environment, the timelines are both long and short. your
Hmm.
design process is very long, especially when you're a student and you have a show assignment. You know this potentially the year before. In terms of, I'm working on this musical, this is going to be maybe a main stage or a capstone or something along those lines. I want to do this with the show. And so you have maybe have a lot of time in designing and planning. And that's kind of what allowed my involvement to be is that um, the main sound designer and one of my very good friends, Zach Ivins, who is the sound designer of that show, heard Eliza at the USITT the year before the next school year started and wanted to maybe try to use one of these systems. So we were in talks for a very long time of trying to work out how to do this from support from a manufacturer side for education, as well as what could be possible within the university kind of world, and especially all the politics and the academia and the red tape. And so that took quite a while, especially on the system design side. But that was able to be done within like budget and constraints within the venue and everything like that, especially with an education focused approach. Um, but then once you hit tech, you had like a week, right? Which is very different from a Broadway or like a perhaps even a regional theater type of deployment, where in regional theater you might have 1 week to 3 weeks, depending on the scale and the programming of that venue that you're in. Broadway can be longer in terms of having a set of previews and all these type of things. But in academia, you maybe have like a week, and then your shows run for 2 weekends, and then that's it. And
Right.
so that's the really truncated and fast part. And the the thing with that is with more comprehensive tools nowadays, especially within the workflow side of things, it has made that significantly easier to on the creative side and the technical implementation, where in the past, if you were having to do maybe everything in QLab with, uh, let's say, 10 sounds that's played back for this one cue, and you have 20 loudspeakers, and this is QLab 2 days, perhaps QLab 3 days before all of the fancy tools. If you had 10 sounds and you had to pan it around the room, that's 10 sounds times 20 fades. So 200 fades to make it spin around, and then the director says, "Hey, make it go the other way." It's like, okay, I'm going to do this during break, right? Or we'll listen to this tomorrow because it's going to take you time. Maybe they want to cut this or move it around. And nowadays, with all of these tools, automate it, spin it around, that'll take you maybe 2 minutes instead of 20 minutes. And that flexibility allows you to be more agile. And
Hmm.
with those things in mind, that's what allowed us to do so much more within Secret Garden than what we could if we were using technology from 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah,
And mhm,
that's really interesting that um, that we've come so far and relatively little time. I mean, in the context of the Secret Garden production,
mhm,
were there elements of the workflow or the deployment that the students latched
mhm,
onto and picked up really quickly? And kind of how did that balance in their existing tech process?
mhm. Uh, so within that show, from a workflow standpoint, uh, we did a lot of, as much as we could, of the legwork to do this in the pre-production side. Back then, we didn't have the binaural tools yet, but we still had the ability to prep like a console file or prep the Eliza file in this case for this show. And so we had all of the inputs already done because that was already part of the delivery package of the your system. So we could already put that into the file. We already had the objects in place, named and associated to be paired with the console ahead of time. And the thing that a lot of these tools have, especially nowadays, is when you're working with a large deployment of audio objects or inputs into these systems, you want the ability from a graphical standpoint to be able to see everything and know where they are in context with each other in space. As in, if if I have 20 actors on stage, if I just had figurines of them, I could move them around and physically do that. That's much more easy to manage from a visual perspective than it is with 20 tracks on a DAW and automation, and you don't really
Right.
see how they line up next to each other. Having the graphical interface that lets you see these 20 actors in the space and moving around makes it really intuitive for you to grab it and move it around easier than maybe an automation lane in the DAW or even on the console sometimes. And so that workflow made it very easy for students to see this, see the tech happen, listen to it in the space, and be like, oh yeah, she's over here. Let me just grab her and move her this way. Or let's build a
Right.
queue. And that made it very intuitive for everybody. And also it made it accessible where in tech we had our assistant who was largely involved on the sound effects side. When she needed to jump in and just grab an object and move it around or place it in space where we took a snapshot, she could do it. It wasn't get into the console, figure out where the pan pod is and do this and save the snapshot. No, just drag it over here, hit save. Okay, let's go on. Um,
Wow.
and so that agility makes it easier for your entire team to be able to work together on maybe this new tech because it's more accessible from a user standpoint.
I see. For the students in the room, or watching, who want to work on these systems, or for the theater students who want to design on them, are there resources available, or what should they focus on, um, even if they don't have access to a room with an immersive audio system and a immersive audio processor installed? Are there ways
Mm-hmm.
of kind of practicing these skills without the very expensive technology that it
Mm-hmm.
requires?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways within the tool set and the workflow that are accessible to students now. Um, just kind of off the top of my head, there's the Spat Revolution from Flux that has a license for education or actually anyone, but they have binaural tools available where you can do this in a headphone environment on the go, especially as a student, or most sound people don't really have like a 20 channel system or even a 5.1 at home. Um, Oftentimes we always have headphones and we're always on the go. And so Spat Revolution has one. There's one from Eliza or L Acoustics from Eliza Studio, which is free software in that kind of environment. Revolution has a very affordable license, even I think a free version as well. There's a couple that if you were to search this online for like immersive audio or spatial audio software and tools and type in binaural, that'll also be very helpful for that. And typically they'll have ways that you can start to use this within your own work and use the same software in the tool set that you would just do in the live environment. And again, it's like learning anything, like learning QLab for the very first time. If you've never done sound, it's a learning curve, right? Um, but then you use it enough, and now it's just part of your toolkit, and you know where all the buttons are, all the shortcuts. You don't have to think about how to use the tool. Same thing with all of these more with these spatial audio ones is the more you use it, the more you play with it, the better you are at using it. And so I would recommend for students is to look up one of those applications, download it, and just start reading up on it. There's often tutorials that these manufacturers and these companies have put out for accessibility and kind of go through that and learn that and incorporate it into your own work and like a school project, especially maybe you have something that's delivered in stereo, make a binaural version of it and present that. And so you have your whole spatial mix going on, and it's still a stereo file at the end of the day, but maybe the deliverable is to say, listen with headphones on, I'm using this new tool to try this out. And it's still not maybe in the theater, but now you've used it for 15 hours. And then next time you have another assignment or another project, use it again, but maybe try for a multi-channel environment. And that's the way I think to get used to the ecosystem. And then the other counterpart is the system design kind of thing. And there's resources online, especially after the COVID time, when all these manufacturers were doing webinars and things like that to talk about their own immersive systems and solutions. And a lot of them are quite similar in its approach and philosophy of loudspeaker design and coverage. And
Mhm.
so that can be read up on and implemented within your next theater show or production. And that again, that's the engine of the car, right? You're designing the engine of the system to drive how you want to drive. But in order to do so, it's learning the software side of the tools to drive how you want to do, whether it's conservative or crazy or whatever. Still, in order to do so, you need the engine to make it happen. But you need
Yeah.
to learn how to drive first. And so those software tools are so accessible nowadays that you can start playing with it right away and then eventually get into implementing it into a real theater.
That's really great that there's a way to dip your toe in without a tremendous investment. I think this is kind of the perfect place for us to stop today. Um, a huge thanks to Jordan for such a thoughtful and engaging conversation. Um, we really appreciate you sharing your time and the expertise that you have in this really exciting and developing field. To our audience, don't forget to register for the 2026 Symposium on Education and Engineering at Purdue that's taking place over the summer on July 24th and 25th. Rachel will drop a link for that in the chat. The symposium is a 2-day highly interactive event that brings together educators and industry professionals to develop actionable ideas for teaching at the intersection of entertainment and engineering. Until then, take care, everyone. Enjoy the summer. We hope to see you in person at the symposium in July, and join us in September as we resume First Fridays at Fusion Studio with another slate of fantastic guests sharing their experience and stories with us. Thanks again, Jordan, and thanks again, everybody, for joining us. So long.
All right. Thank you very much.